The world awoke on Friday, June 13, 2025, to the terrifying drumbeat of war. News alerts flashed across screens, painting a grim picture of a Middle East pushed to the very edge of a catastrophic conflict. Israeli warplanes had torn through Iranian skies, unleashing a torrent of destruction on facilities central to Tehran's nuclear ambitions. The act, long threatened but never realized on this scale, shattered the fragile peace of the region. Suddenly, the abstract fear of a wider war became a horrifyingly tangible reality. The overnight strikes were not just a military operation, they were a profound escalation, a gamble that could ignite a firestorm engulfing nations far beyond the immediate theater of conflict. Panic rippled through global capitals, from Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Brussels. Leaders scrambled for information, their urgent calls echoing the anxiety felt by millions. Was this the opening salvo of World War III? The question, once confined to history books and speculative fiction, was now being asked with genuine dread. The immediate Iranian response, a barrage of ballistic missiles aimed at Tel Aviv, only deepened the sense of impending doom. This was no longer a shadow war fought through proxies. It was a direct, state-on-state confrontation between two of the region's most powerful and implacable enemies, a nightmare scenario playing out in real time. Financial markets convulsed with the news, reacting with the predictable speed of digital fear. Oil prices surged to terrifying new heights, threatening to cripple economies still recovering from years of instability. The specter of blocked shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, a vital artery for global energy, fueled the economic chaos. For ordinary people across the globe, the crisis translated into immediate concerns: the rising cost of fuel, the safety of loved ones in the region, and the unsettling feeling that the world had just become a much more dangerous place. The stability that so many had taken for granted seemed to be evaporating with every passing hour. As of today, Saturday, June 14, 2025, the world remains on a razor's edge, holding its collective breath. The initial shock has given way to a tense, uncertain waiting game. The key players, Israel, Iran, and the United States, are locked in a perilous standoff, their next moves shrouded in secrecy and fraught with immense risk. Diplomatic channels are strained to the breaking point, and the rhetoric from all sides grows more heated. The international community watches, largely powerless, as the situation teeters between a fragile de-escalation and the abyss of an all-out regional war with unimaginable consequences for all of humanity. The Israeli assault, codenamed Operation Rising Lion, was a military operation of staggering scale and precision. In the pre-dawn hours of Thursday, June 12, a formidable force of over 200 Israeli fighter jets, including advanced F-35 stealth fighters, streaked across the sky toward Iran. They struck with overwhelming force, targeting more than 100 separate sites across the country. The mission's primary objective was clear and audacious: to systematically dismantle the infrastructure of Iran's nuclear program and cripple its ballistic missile capabilities. This was not a limited strike, it was a comprehensive nationwide attack designed to set back Iran's military ambitions by years, if not decades, and send an unequivocal message of Israeli resolve. The operation was unprecedented in its scope. Never before had Israel projected such military power so deeply into Iranian territory. The targets included known uranium enrichment facilities, missile production plants, and command and control centers. According to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the strikes were a preemptive necessity. He claimed that Israel possessed intelligence indicating Iran had enriched enough fissile material for several nuclear weapons, and was developing missiles capable of carrying such payloads. The attack, he argued, was a defensive measure to prevent a nuclear-armed tyrant from threatening the very existence of the State of Israel. It was a justification rooted in a deep-seated fear of annihilation. Iran's response was swift and furious. Within hours of the Israeli assault, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a volley of ballistic missiles toward the bustling metropolis of Tel Aviv. Air raid sirens wailed as Israel's Iron Dome and Arrow defense systems scrambled to intercept the incoming threats. While most missiles were successfully intercepted, the act itself was a powerful statement. Iran officially labeled the missile launch a declaration of war, signaling that it would not absorb such a devastating attack without a forceful and direct answer. The exchange transformed the long-simmering covert conflict into a hot, overt war, with each side daring the other to escalate further. The aftermath of the strikes left a landscape of destruction and heightened tension. While Israel declared the operation a resounding success, some key questions remain. Notably, the heavily fortified Fordow uranium enrichment facility, buried deep beneath a mountain, was reportedly not targeted in the initial wave. Was this a strategic omission, leaving a target for a future attack? Or was it a sign of the limits of even Israel's advanced military capabilities? The full extent of the damage is still being assessed, but one thing is certain: Operation Rising Lion has irrevocably altered the strategic balance in the Middle East, pushing the region into its most dangerous chapter yet. In the chaotic hours following the Israeli strikes, U.S. President Donald Trump seized the moment with characteristic bravado and showmanship. From the White House, he did not call for restraint. Instead, he applauded the Israeli action, hailing the strikes as excellent and a necessary consequence of Iranian intransigence. He then pivoted to deliver a stark, direct ultimatum to the leadership in Tehran. Make a new, comprehensive nuclear deal, he demanded, before there is nothing left of your country to negotiate with. It was a message delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, blending a supposed offer of diplomacy with the explicit threat of annihilation, a tactic that has become a hallmark of his foreign policy. Trump's rhetoric was deliberately menacing, designed to instill maximum fear and pressure on the Iranian regime. He warned that the Israeli assault was just the beginning. There's more to come. A lot more, he declared in a series of social media posts and a subsequent press conference. He ominously hinted at further pre-planned attacks that would be even more brutal than what had already transpired. This was not just support for an ally, it was a clear signal that the United States was prepared to endorse and perhaps even participate in a sustained campaign of military destruction against Iran if its demands were not met. He was transforming a regional crisis into a high-stakes negotiation with a gun to Iran's head. The president also revealed the context behind the timing of the crisis. He disclosed that his administration had given Iran a secret 60-day ultimatum to agree to the framework of a new nuclear deal, an ultimatum that expired on the very day of the Israeli attack. Today is day 61, Trump wrote on social media. I told them what to do, but they just couldn't get there. Now they have, perhaps, a second chance. This revelation framed the Israeli strikes not as a unilateral act of aggression, but as the punitive enforcement of a deadline set by Washington, casting the U.S. as the puppet master pulling the strings of the conflict to achieve its own diplomatic objectives. The world was left to grapple with a U.S. president who was openly using a military crisis as a negotiating tool. Trump's position appeared to have shifted dramatically. Just a day before the strikes, he had reportedly opposed an Israeli attack, fearing it would blow up the delicate diplomatic efforts being brokered by his envoy. But once the bombs fell, he reversed course completely, leveraging the violence to create what he saw as the ultimate form of leverage. His message was brutally simple: capitulate to American demands, or face a future of relentless and escalating military punishment. The world now waits to see if this dangerous gambit will force Iran to the table or push it into a devastating war. Officially, the United States has maintained a careful distance from the Israeli operation. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was quick to issue a formal statement asserting that the U.S. was not involved in the planning or execution of the strikes. He characterized the attack as a unilateral action taken by Israel to defend its own sovereign interests. This official denial is a crucial piece of diplomatic maneuvering, designed to provide a veneer of separation and potentially shield the U.S. from direct and immediate Iranian retaliation. It allows Washington to publicly advocate for de-escalation, while its closest regional ally prosecutes a major military campaign. However, this official narrative of non-involvement began to fray almost immediately. President Trump himself contradicted his own administration's stance, claiming he was fully in the loop on the Israeli plans. This boastful admission, intended to project an image of control and authority, simultaneously undermined the official U.S. position. Further complicating the denial, an anonymous U.S. source confirmed to reporters that the United States had provided exquisite intelligence to Israel in the lead-up to the attack. This suggests a level of cooperation that goes far beyond simple awareness, pointing toward active American support for the operation, even if U.S. forces did not pull any triggers. The evidence of American assistance extends beyond intelligence sharing. In the weeks prior to Operation Rising Lion, the US had quietly but significantly resupplied Israel's Iron Dome and other missile defense systems, ensuring its ally was well prepared for the inevitable Iranian counterattack. Furthermore, the US military began evacuating non-essential personnel and their families from embassies and bases across the region a full 24 hours before the first bombs fell on Iran. Such a move is a classic indicator that US officials had foreknowledge of an impending military action, raising serious questions about the sincerity of their public statements of surprise and non-involvement. Ultimately, the US role appears to be one of calculated ambiguity. While American planes may not have flown alongside Israeli jets, the operation was likely enabled and tacitly approved by Washington. The deployment of US B-52 and B-2 bombers to the island of Diego Garcia since March 2025 serves as another ominous sign. A powerful US strike force positioned and ready to engage should the conflict escalate. This strategy allows President Trump to have it both ways. He can avoid direct blame for initiating the conflict, while simultaneously using the crisis his allies started as leverage to force Iran into a diplomatic corner of his own making. This current crisis is not a sudden eruption but honestly, the violent culmination of a decades-long standoff, a tangled history of animosity, mistrust, and nuclear ambition. The roots of the conflict stretch all the way back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which transformed Iran from a US ally into a sworn enemy, famously branding America the Great Satan and Israel the Little Satan. Since then, the relationship has been defined by proxy wars, sanctions, and a deep-seated ideological clash. At the heart of this long and bitter struggle has been Iran's nuclear program, which Tehran has always insisted is for peaceful energy purposes, a claim that Israel and the United States have never really accepted. For Israel, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran is, well, an existential threat. Israeli leaders across the political spectrum have viewed Iran's nuclear development not as a deterrent, but as a direct step toward a second Holocaust. This fear has driven a consistent policy of prevention, including covert operations, cyber attacks like the Stuxnet virus, and assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. These actions were all part of a long shadow war designed to sabotage and delay the Iranian program. The recent Operation Rising Lion represents the ultimate escalation of this policy, moving from covert sabotage to overt military destruction in a desperate bid to eliminate the threat once and for all. The United States has navigated this tense dynamic with a fluctuating mix of diplomacy and coercion. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, often called the Iran nuclear deal, under the Obama administration, represented a high watermark for diplomacy. It lifted crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for verifiable limits on its nuclear program. However, President Trump unilaterally withdrew the US from this agreement in 2018, calling it the worst deal ever and reimposing a maximum pressure campaign of sanctions. This move shattered the diplomatic framework and, according to critics, set Iran back on the path toward nuclear development, ultimately leading to the current confrontation. The cycle of tension has been relentless. Every Iranian step forward in uranium enrichment was met with harsher US sanctions and more explicit Israeli threats. Every Israeli act of sabotage was met with defiant Iranian rhetoric and further nuclear advancements. This tit-for-tat escalation created a feedback loop of hostility that made a direct military clash almost inevitable. The strikes on June 12 were not the beginning of the story but rather a predictable, if terrifying, new chapter in a long and tragic saga of failed diplomacy and escalating aggression, with the specter of nuclear weapons looming over every decision. The shockwaves from the Israeli strikes on Iran radiated across the globe almost instantly, triggering a cascade of economic and political consequences. The most immediate and honestly visceral impact was on global energy markets. As news of the attack spread, the price of Brent crude oil skyrocketed, surging more than 15% in just a matter of hours. This dramatic spike really reflected deep-seated fears that a wider regional war could disrupt the flow of oil from the Middle East, particularly through the vital Strait of Hormuz, which is this narrow choke point where nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply travels. The threat of a blockade sent traders and governments into, well, a panic, promising higher gas prices for consumers worldwide and threatening to trigger a global recession. Beyond the economic fallout, the crisis has sown political chaos and diplomatic anxiety. Alliances were tested as nations were forced to choose sides or, navigate a pretty treacherous middle ground. Russia and China, traditional allies of Iran, condemned the Israeli attack and called for immediate de-escalation, while European powers, caught between their alliance with the United States and their desire for stability, issued frantic calls for restraint from all parties. The United Nations Security Council scheduled an emergency session, but with veto powers held by key players like the US, the prospect of any meaningful unified international action seemed honestly pretty slim. The world's diplomatic institutions appeared paralyzed in the face of such a direct and dangerous confrontation. For people around the world, the conflict has brought a renewed sense of fear and helplessness. In cities across the globe, news channels broadcast unsettling images of explosions in Iran and missile defense systems lighting up the sky over Tel Aviv. The rhetoric from leaders, especially President Trump's talk of brutal future attacks, amplified the feeling that the world was stumbling toward a major war with unpredictable and devastating consequences. Protests erupted in some cities, with demonstrators calling for peace and denouncing the military escalation. The crisis dominated conversations online and offline, a stark reminder of how interconnected our world is, and just how quickly a regional conflict can become a global concern. The fear of a broader conflagration is, palpable. Military analysts are gaming out terrifying scenarios. Would Hezbollah, Iran's powerful proxy in Lebanon, open a second front against Israel? Would Iranian-backed militias attack US troops stationed in Iraq and Syria? Could a miscalculation by any side lead to the use of even more destructive weapons? These are no longer academic questions. They are the urgent, terrifying possibilities that define the current global landscape. The crisis has pulled the entire world into its orbit, making everyone a stakeholder in a conflict that threatens to spiral out of control. Just days before the crisis exploded, there was a fragile glimmer of hope for a diplomatic solution. A sixth round of nuclear talks between the United States and Iran, secretly brokered by White House envoy Steve Witkoff, was scheduled to take place on Sunday, June 15th, in the neutral territory of Oman. These negotiations were the culmination of months of painstaking behind-the-scenes efforts to find a pathway back from the brink. The goal was to hammer out a new agreement that would address President Trump's concerns while providing Iran with the sanctions relief it desperately needed. It was a long shot, but honestly, it was the only peaceful option on the table. The Israeli airstrikes and President Trump's subsequent ultimatum completely obliterated that diplomatic off-ramp. In the wake of the attack, which it viewed as a coordinated act of aggression by Israel and the United States, Iran immediately and publicly announced its withdrawal from the upcoming talks. An Iranian foreign ministry spokesman declared that there was nothing to discuss with a government that negotiates with bombs and threats. The message was clear: Iran would not be coerced into submission. The very act that Trump claimed was designed to create leverage had, in fact, destroyed the only existing forum for negotiation. The diplomatic collapse has left the international community with few, if any, viable options. The channels of communication that had been so carefully constructed have now gone silent. The trust required for even the most basic dialogue has evaporated, replaced by open hostility and the threat of further military action. Efforts by European allies and the United Nations to mediate have been flatly rejected by Iran, which now views any Western-led initiative with extreme suspicion. The collapse is not just a temporary setback, it represents a fundamental breakdown of the diplomatic process, leaving a vacuum that is being rapidly filled by military posturing and warmongering. With diplomacy in ruins, the situation is more dangerous than ever. Without an open line of communication, the risk of a miscalculation or an unintended escalation increases exponentially. Every military movement, every public statement is now interpreted through the lens of maximum threat. Iran is now faced with a stark choice: absorb the devastating attack and accept a humiliating negotiation under duress, or retaliate further and risk a full-scale war against both Israel and, potentially, the United States. The bridge to a peaceful resolution has been burned, and all that remains is a perilous path forward into an unknown and, honestly, pretty frightening future. The sudden escalation in the Middle East has sent fractures across the global community, drawing sharp lines of division and sparking heated debate in the court of public opinion. People around the world are grappling with the complex moral and strategic questions raised by the crisis, and to be honest, there is little consensus to be found. How you view these events likely depends heavily on where you live and what you believe. Is Israel's attack a legitimate act of self-defense against an existential threat? Or is it a reckless act of aggression that has needlessly endangered millions of lives and pushed the world closer to a catastrophic war? Supporters of the Israeli and American position argue that decisive action was long overdue. They point to Iran's hostile rhetoric, its funding of terrorist proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas, and its continued defiance of international norms regarding its nuclear program. From this perspective, Operation Rising Lion was a necessary evil, a painful but essential step to prevent a fanatical regime from acquiring the ultimate weapon. They see President Trump's ultimatum not as a threat but as a moment of clarity, a final chance for Iran to choose a path of peace and rejoin the international community. For them, strength is the only language that the Iranian leadership understands. Conversely, a significant portion of global opinion has reacted with horror and condemnation. Critics view the Israeli strikes as a grave violation of international law and a catastrophic strategic blunder. They argue that the attack has not only failed to solve the nuclear issue, but has likely strengthened the resolve of hardliners in Iran, making a diplomatic solution impossible and a regional war almost certain. This camp sees President Trump's actions as cynical and dangerous, accusing him of using the lives of innocent people as bargaining chips in a high-stakes geopolitical game. They fear this crisis will destabilize the entire region and mire the United States in yet another endless Middle Eastern conflict. This is a moment of profound global anxiety, and, we want to know what you think. Is the maximum pressure campaign a viable strategy for peace, or is it a recipe for disaster? Should the international community stand with the United States and Israel, or should it work to censure them for their aggressive actions? The debate is raging on social media, in parliaments, and at dinner tables around the world. We encourage you to share your own perspective on this critical issue. Your voice is part of a global conversation that will shape the course of this conflict and determine the kind of world we will live in tomorrow. As of today, June 14, 2025, the situation remains dangerously unstable, balanced on the sharp edge of a knife. The immediate flurry of attacks and counterattacks has subsided into a tense, ominous silence, but no one really believes this is the end. It feels more like the deep breath before the plunge. The world is now watching Iran, waiting to see how it will respond to the dual pressures of a devastating military strike and an uncompromising American ultimatum. Tehran's next move will be the most critical decision in this crisis, potentially determining whether the region descends into a full-blown war or finds an unlikely path back from the brink. The military posture across the region is one of high alert. Israel's defense forces remain fully mobilized, its skies patrolled by fighter jets, its missile defense batteries ready for another barrage. In the Persian Gulf and on the island of Diego Garcia, U.S. forces are in a heightened state of readiness, a formidable display of power meant to deter Iran and reassure allies. Meanwhile, Iran's own military is undoubtedly preparing a range of potential responses, from further missile strikes to asymmetric attacks on shipping or U.S. interests via its regional proxies. The entire Middle East is a tinderbox, and honestly, a single spark could set it ablaze. President Trump convened his National Security Council on Friday morning to deliberate on the path forward, and he has been in close contact with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Their shared strategy appears to be one of escalating pressure, gambling that the Iranian regime will eventually crack. But this is a gamble with monumental stakes. If Iran chooses defiance over capitulation, the even more brutal attacks promised by President Trump could become a reality, drawing the United States directly into the conflict and triggering the regional war that the entire world fears. The fate of millions rests on the calculations being made in the war rooms of Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran. We are in uncharted territory. The old rules of engagement have been shattered, and the diplomatic guardrails have been dismantled. The crisis has exposed the fragility of our global order and the terrifying speed at which decades of simmering tension can erupt into open conflict. The danger of a larger, more destructive war is not a distant possibility, it is a real and present threat. The coming hours and days will be critical. The world watches, waits, and, hopes that leaders on all sides can find the wisdom and restraint to pull back from the abyss before it is too late.